I'll try to background my talk today very briefly by explaining the trajectory of the journal Latin American Perspectives in the context of what it focuses on, namely Latin America. It describes itself as a theoretical and scholarly journal for discussion and debate on the political economy of capitalism, imperialism and socialism in the Americas, and that's been essentially its mission statement since its first issue in 1973. So it's about to become 45 years old. I'm much younger than that. I've only been part of it for 20 years. It has a collective structure. The majority of the editors are participating editors, which would be around about 60% of the journal. Then above us, there's another level who are essentially senior editors, but who are living mainly in Latin America or for varied reasons can't make the editorial meetings, which are more or less bi-monthly. And then above that group is, if you like, the senior editorial group or the managing editorial group. What I call the Western academic bloc in my précis is, in these terms, what I'm intending. The hegemonic neoliberal corporate academy and its representatives, as well as think tanks and the for-profit research and development institutes. I'm going to talk about two struggles today, one in 2014 over the Zionist re-invasion of Gaza and the other in 2015 over what appeared to be an innocuous advertisement for a journal. Forgive the bottom section there being a little out of date, but this was written in 2014 and it shows essentially a strong support in Latin America, quite clearly majority support in Latin America for Palestine and against that invasion in July 2014. I've said in several forums, in fact, that if we define BDS in very loose terms, then Cuba was the first country 30 years or so, before BDS began to initiate a boycott of Israel for its activities, its horrendous activities against Palestinians in Palestine. That was in 1973. Then Venezuela in 2009, and then others have followed suit, so that the picture from the point of view of pro-Palestinian activity is very strong. In 2014, which is what I've called in the summary LAP-OP1, Occupied Palestine 1. A US resident Cuban-born editor posted around 6 new articles to our e-list, carrying condemnation by several of these Latin American governments on the screen of the 2014 invasion. And his posts all appeared in quite quick succession. One other senior editor distributed complementary material by Michael Chusodowski from the Global Research website. There are around 110 editors all up, including all 3 tiers of the editorial structure. And of that 110 in 2014, 6 publicly condemned the Pino emails. The name of this editor was or is Julio Pino, I failed to mention. But they only focused on the very last couple of words in his posts, which I think I can pick up on page 2 here. If it's visible, his posts all had, and Allah has promised you one or two great things, victory or martyrdom. There might have been a variation on that occasionally, but that was essentially what incensed people who were, other than for the 6 public, very quiet about who they were in the first debate. The managing editor then reported that many more people offline had condemned what Pino had posted, but he didn't name any of them. This was a tactic which was to become quite important for management in the second struggle. Its real effect, though, was to allow management to run this as a kind of top-down dispute, where we, the rank and file, the majority of the editors, got very little information, and in particular, none of the Zionist editors who would later be flushed out, if you like, went public in the first dispute in OP1. And they had, in fact, no need to do so. Pino, regrettably, in my analysis, adopted a very bad strategy, an individualist strategy. He didn't first test the waters. He didn't first check who of us were on the journal collective, who might have been supportive and who might have been in our own humble ways, contributing to a pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist activity. And the net result was that he was suspended from the E-list, and a number of the posts he'd made were hidden from the rest of the editorial collective. The editorial management sent out this very long account, which later turned out to have questionable assumptions and questionable statements in it. And it said at the end, and this is the key paragraph, that we, namely the management, considered the matter closed and asked that no other editors get involved in any discussion with or about Pino, and asked us to, if you like, report any approaches that were made to us. And to be quite honest, I think I fell down at the time in not disputing this more, or at all indeed publicly. I remember there were a few of us who discussed by email our concerns, but very little happened. But it seems to me that from that we can see the obvious top-down way that particular dispute was handled. It wasn't handled that way by Latin American civil society in 2014. These are just samples of the tremendous outpouring of support for Palestine in the middle of 2014 from across Latin America. We don't have time to translate, but they're all very pro-Palestine, anti-occupation, anti-invasion kinds of demonstrations and manifestations of support, solidarity with Palestine, literally across the continent from Mexico to Argentina and Chile. I stop briefly on this one because you'll see it's bilingual. Puerto Rico is still a US colony, despite the majority of Puerto Ricans not wanting that from the time they were occupied in 1898. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Panama. You'll notice also, if you have a chance to recall the first map, or I'll go back to it very quickly, that not all the countries represented in civil protests there line up here. For example, Panama is not included. That is to say, the official position of the Panamanian government was very much in the kind of Western hemispheric, where the US backyard scenario. Down further, Paraguay had, in 2012, experienced a constitutional coup where the elected president was removed and a pro-US stooge government set up. Colombia, of course, the centre of the Colombia Plan, which is essentially a series of US bases that are intended to surround Venezuela, as are the countries here, Suriname, Guyana, and the disputed territory here, which is disputed between Venezuela et al. And you can see up here a couple of Central American countries, Costa Rica in particular. So the outcome was his expulsion, and little more heard of it until in 2015, as a person who very rarely reads back covers, that appeared on the back cover of the journal. A journal which from the start, and quite legitimately, presented itself as a left-wing journal, which has some of the most distinguished Marxist political economists on the planet in it, which has, from memory, a slight majority still of Latin American editors living in Latin America, publishing in a journal which directs itself to a continent whose civil society is overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian, publishing a journal from the University of Tel Aviv. I might say in passing, because nothing's ever quite what it seems on the surface, that the editor listed here, Gerardo Liebner, is actually a Uruguayan Jew who I believe returned to Israel. And I'm in occasional correspondence with Gerardo, and he sent his best wishes for this conference. And during the dispute, which I'm about to describe, he was a kind of left channel of information from the University of Tel Aviv, and in a sort of way explained to us that we were on the right track. So from there, I wrote an email to people I thought would be sympathetic. Nobody moved. I picked a next group, if you like, a next tier of editors, and finally a very fine professor of history of Latin America, namely Pablo Pozzi from the Universidad de Buenos Aires, came on board, and he and I published a statement. Forgive me, it's a bit long, but we published this pro-PACBI statement on or about, I think, the 5th of June 2015. And I exaggerate not, all hell broke loose. In the months which followed between us launching this petition and the eventual statement published in the journal, there were a minimum of around 600 emails, but a number of them carried other emails in them. So I didn't get a chance to count them all, but I'd say safely there were well over 1,000 emails exchanged. It was this second dispute which drew the Zionist nucleus out into the open and an accompanying PEP block, with one Zionist editor, for example, admitting that he had a posting at an Israel university which he suppressed in the list of editors. It was not clear at all. It looked like he was only based in the United States. The PEP block is in fact quite sizable and has allowed the Zionists, who in total in the end were only around 7 or 8 of 110, to influence the journal's politics in a way disproportionately larger than its numbers, let alone the morality of its position. I asked myself how many of those who were outraged on the senior management group by Pinel's position in 2014 were outraged by the advertisement in 2015. The answer, by the way, is 1. In fact, it's nil. The answer, sadly, is nil. Until the initiative by Posse and Austin, and for whatever reasons of conscious or unconscious nature, the entire collective, either by default or by design, endorsed the publication of this advertisement. So, where does this leave the journal at the end of the dispute? Firstly, again, management was in control of publicising the results of the debate. The real results of the debate I'll leave for a moment, but according to the managing editor speaking on behalf of the senior editors, by the end of the discussion, by the end of the debate, only 35 or so editors were definitively pro-PACBI. Can you hand that statement around? I've got about 10 copies of what was eventually published in the journal, and I'll speak to that briefly in a moment. However, all of the key emails in this indicated quite differently in terms of statistics. The pro-BDS group eventually is 36. That's the declared group. Then there was a partial group, that is to say people who'd come out during the debate and said, look, I'm for it, but I'm concerned about cohesion within the editorial collective, the damage the debate might be doing us, and certain other concerns of a peripheral nature. That group was 7. The anti-BDS group, in the end, who included one non-editor who was somehow or other still on the list and allowed to, well, frankly, rant on the list. All up, they were 9, the anti-BDS group. However, I figured mathematically, if the partial and the anti were added, the pro-BDS still had a better than 2-to-1 margin. But if partial and pro are added, it was a margin just under 5-to-1. And that includes gleaning statistics from people who wrote direct to me, said, we're absolutely with you, but we're scared of our career could be on the line here. A lot of young academics are being... The journal has, in my view, a fine approach to young academics. It tries to bring through young academics, particularly Latin Americans, expose their work early in their career to general readership, and it's a very positive approach. And many of them, it turned out, were absolutely livid or scared about the effect that this might have. But in the end, it was quite clear we had a very big margin. The statement that you're getting, and I haven't got one in front of me, but it has a couple of inaccuracies. The most important one at the end of the introduction, which was written by management, is to infer that the pro-PACBI group opposed an open democratic ballot. It says we opposed a ballot. It doesn't say that what we opposed, in fact, was a secret ballot, because that would have left the whole decision in the end in the hands of management, which by that stage had shown quite clearly it was prepared to distort the statistics and make the pro-PACBI group look smaller than it really was. As a result, we refused a ballot we weren't even allowed to have representation. Were there going to be any kind of other ballot in the end? And so we said, no ballot, we'll just make our statement. And indeed, in the end, a very positive statement was made. It includes, apart from very minor historians, it includes some of the most important intellectuals on the planet in terms of Latin American studies. We also gained, apart from the publication of that statement, which we drew up and was unedited in its published version, we also won a special issue on Israel and Palestine in Latin America, to be managed by two of our own group. The group who eventually moved all this, I should have mentioned at the start, was eventually titled the Gang of Six. We were a gang of one, then two, then kept on multiplying, got to six. And it seems to me we also achieved, although the evidence is a bit sparse at the moment, a long-term weakening of the Zionist position within the journal. It's been exposed for all to see, and it's now public knowledge in the wider global community as to what's happened. And we probably achieved, although again I don't have a way of measuring it, a modest strengthening of PACBI in the field of Latin American studies. And hopefully, of course, a contribution to the liberation of Palestine, as Salvador Allende would have said, más temprano que tarde, earlier than later. I'll leave it there, and thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. Hi, everyone. Well, I think it's clear that among the most predictable Zionist charges against BDS in universities is its alleged violation of academic freedom. Zionists denounce boycott proponents for their disrespect for what Russell A. Berman refers to as the free flow of ideas within the international scholarly community. And, you know, the remoteness of that ideal in a world of checkpoints, siege, and apartheid has very frequently been pointed out, and I don't need to do so again. In Palestine, it's obvious that academic ideas don't flow free, but are rather stunningly contained by the various apparatuses of settler colonial violence, and they're apparatuses which, more often than not, BDS opponents typically show fairly little interest in dismantling. So the academic freedom argument against BDS raises the question of how that concept, the concept of academic freedom itself, is to be understood. Because when BDS opponents complain that the boycott violates academic freedom, what they seem to have in mind is the definition you've got on the screen. Individual academics' right to teach, inquire, and communicate their research freely, and especially their right not to be excluded from academic fora overseas. And before we explore this in any more detail, we need to remind ourselves that according to the PACBI academic boycott guidelines, the official boycott guidelines, and I'm now quoting, mere affiliation of Israeli scholars to an Israeli academic institution is not grounds for applying the boycott. So in other words, being employed at an Israeli university doesn't make you boycottable in itself. To be subject to the boycott, you need to be either an official of an Israeli institution, you know, a dean or a president, or you need to be invoking some institutional connection beyond mere affiliation. For instance, an exchange scheme, as some of us in this room know all too well, or a university conference or something like that. So the upshot of that is that academic exchange is actually far less limited by the academic boycott than is commonly supposed, and we need to remember that. As it stands, though, the definition on the screen is obviously silent on some essential questions, in particular that of which academics are entitled to academic freedom rights in the first place. But it also ignores a crucial fact. Academic freedom, in the sense intended by boycott opponents, just isn't characteristic of the ordinary activities of the academy. The academy is not a place characterised by academic freedom in the sense in which boycott opponents understand it. The ordinary conduct of research and teaching, and indeed the working life of universities in general, are both in fact already constituted by violations of academic freedom as BDS opponents seem to understand it. because I want to argue that academic exchange is intrinsically bound up not with the free exchange of ideas, but rather with their regulation, or put differently, their restriction, or maybe even their censorship by others, and also in consequence by the exclusion of academics from different fora. Now that's actually not a very surprising conclusion, even in light of traditional definitions of academic freedom, because those traditional definitions contain an element that boycott opponents typically miss out. On the traditional understanding, academic freedom isn't just about individual academics' rights, even though that's the way boycott opponents typically construe it. Typically, academic freedom is just as much a matter of the corporate right of universities to self-governance, free of external influence, particularly the states. So the principle of academic freedom prohibits outside actors from controlling or regulating academic business. Of course, though, academic business is far from anarchical. It's highly regulated, but that regulation happens at the hands of academics themselves rather than by any external body. So traditionally, universities assert academic freedom in order to insist that the right to regulate speech and other activities of their members is vested in universities themselves, not in anyone else. Now, if we give full due to that standard definition of academic freedom, there are some interesting implications for the way that anti-Zionists like us should argue for BDS. While we can and should oppose the discrimination and physical oppression that denies Palestinians access to higher learning, of course we should oppose that, we should do that without acquiescing to a chimerical fantasy of what academic freedom under non-oppressive conditions is like. And we also shouldn't allow Zionists to get away with the claim that the academic boycott is somehow a departure from the usual norms of supposedly free scholarly exchange. It's quite the opposite. BDS is consistent with academic freedom in the traditional sense, since it's an instance of the precise self-regulation of the academic sphere. And I'll talk about this a bit. Universities' meritocratic ideology likes to insist that it's intellectual attainment rather than anything else that determines who gets excluded from what. So my paper only gets rejected from X conference if it's not good enough, not because someone doesn't like my politics. That's the myth. In the context of debates over BDS, though, it's crucial to recognise that individual academics regularly restrict academic exchange for reasons other than these purely notionally intellectual or disciplinary ones. So here is a small selection of examples of this from over the last 5 years alone, less than half the time, in other words, that the academic boycott has been running. So you can see that the extortionate prices charged by Elsevier have led to over 16,000 researchers boycotting its academic journals in various ways, refusing to publish in them, refusing, like me, to undertake peer review work or to join editorial boards of Elsevier journals. In 2015, the entire editorial board of the Elsevier journal Lingua, in my discipline, linguistics, resigned en masse to set up an open access substitute. And some of those editors, or at least one of those editors, said that he would look very poorly on any person who published or was an editor of Lingua in any job applications or assessments that crossed his path. So attempts like these are direct efforts to restrict the academic freedom of certain academics, authors or would-be publishers in Elsevier journals, in order to fulfil a greater good. In other words, in order to fulfil or in order to bring about a wider academic freedom on a more general scale. Since 1989, at least 22 academic journals have been subject to similar mass editorial resignations, with all of the academic freedom implications that holds. In 2013, scientists boycotted a NASA conference that excluded Chinese researchers. There was a call for the boycott of the 2015 International Congress of Quantum Chemistry, adopted by over 1,500 researchers. There's a growing international movement, both in and outside academia, to boycott panels and conferences with inadequate representation of women. There was the call signed by thousands of researchers worldwide for a boycott of international conferences held in the US in the wake of the Muslim ban. 3 conferences held this year in Thailand have been the subject of a boycott call on the grounds of the absence of academic freedom in that country. In 2012, there was a boycott called for by Romanian researchers to protest against the plagiarism of the Prime Minister, and the list just goes on. I don't think I need to run through all of the examples other than to point out that, strikes are a particularly, clear form of academic boycott, where academics refuse to teach. They compromise their students' academic freedom, their freedom to learn, in order to achieve a higher good. And I just noticed the other day there's a targeted academic boycott call that has just been issued very recently against certain Turkish universities. So I hope my point is clear. Boycotting is going on in academia all the time. And these boycotts offer, I think, close parallels to the PACBI boycott of Israeli academic institutions. In all of the cases that I've mentioned, academics curtail the putative free flow of ideas by withdrawing from certain arenas of collaboration with colleagues or students. But the researchers who refuse to collaborate with Elsevier, or who refuse to take part in conferences without women, or do any of these other boycott actions, couldn't reasonably be accused of acting against academic freedom. Actually, they're acting for it by refusing to take part in institutions and practices which they judge inimical to it. And there's an important sense, and you'll see the importance of this in a moment, there's an important sense in which I think we can characterise researchers in this position, academics in this position, as not engaged in boycott activity at all. Actually, they're engaged in counter-boycotts. They're engaged in counter-boycotts. They're temporarily reducing the free flow of ideas precisely in order to increase it overall, in order to remove an existing boycott, if you wish, that is already in place as a result of certain structural factors that they wish to clear away. Something that's often forgotten in these debates is that the boycotteurs are restricting their own academic freedom as much as, if not more than, anyone else's. So Israeli academic officials will be refused participation at a boycotters conference. So if I run a conference, I will refuse participation from a dean of an Israeli university, but I will allow any rank and file Israeli academic who is merely affiliated with an Israeli university to take part. I, however, can't go to any conference in Israel, and I can't publish in any journal sponsored by an Israeli institution at all. So I think giving full due to that rather changes the moral situation we're in. The boycotter is not imposing a wrong on the boycotted or the boycottee from which they are completely immune. They are themselves sharing in and liable to a restriction which they're imposing in the name of some greater academic good. And the question arises, of course, as to why we do that. Why would researchers restrict their own and others' academic freedom in this way? And I think the answer is perhaps intuitive. Presumably it's because we want to ensure that our profession is exercised ethically. It's not just that any one of us wants to act ethically themselves. We want our profession to be governed by ethical norms. Essential, I think, to academics' liberal self-image as creative and autonomous intellectuals is the idea that they have a responsibility to continually monitor and, if necessary, correct the norms and the nature of their professional milieu. And this boycott activity forms part of that. So, when academics in Italy refuse to participate in the National Research Assessment exercise, when Australian ones exert pressure to prevent a climate change minimiser opening a research centre, or when Swedish ones boycott a racism and extremism centre because they think it's too politicised, they're all engaged in that kind of action. They're trying to shape the norms that govern their profession, just as an adherent of the PACBI boycott is as well. Now, these considerations, I think, place the academic boycott argument, the academic freedom argument against BDS in a delicate position. those who object to BDS on academic freedom grounds owe boycotters a reply to the following question, the question on the screen. What is it about the Israel-Palestine question that magically disqualifies BDS as a legitimate academic political act that would not also immediately disqualify other exercises of academics' prerogative to restrict their colleagues and their own academic freedom on political or moral grounds? If respect for academic freedom rules out BDS against Israel, what, if anything, rules it in for other attempts to practice academic activity ethically, like all the ones I've just described? All boycotts are intended to exert pressure on academic disciplines in progressive directions, yet they could all be denounced as violations of academic freedom. So boycott opponents have to tell us what's special about this issue that rules out the academic boycott in this case, which also doesn't rule it out in all of the others. And they can do two things, a boycott opponent. They can do two things here. They can either produce a credible reason for which the Israeli boycott is different, but other boycotts are okay, or they can accept that nothing separates the Israeli boycott from other boycott calls. Each position brings uncomfortable consequences. If the boycott opponent accepts the legitimacy of other academic boycotts than the Israel one, that then entails abandoning the argument against BDS from academic freedom, because other academic boycotts violate academic freedom just as much as the Israeli one does. But if those other boycotts, the Elsevier boycott, strikes, the male conference boycott, if those boycotts are acceptable, then academic freedom can't be the decisive argument against BDS of Israel that boycott opponents apparently intended as. Because academic freedom can apparently be violated in these other circumstances. And the boycott supporter only need ask, why we shouldn't also violate academic freedom in the case of Israel, since it's regularly violated in other cases. The second position, acknowledging that BDS of Israel is no different from other academic boycotts, requires academic boycott opponents to condemn all academic boycotts. And that would rule out all of these kinds of activity. And it's striking, that vocal BDS opponents have often not hesitated to participate in violations of their colleagues' academic freedom for other political purposes. So Alan Dershowitz has stated outright that a counter boycott is justified in the face of a boycott. It is not open to the same objections as the boycott itself. I've already argued that BDS should be seen as a counter boycott in the relevant sense. Carey Nelson, one of the most prominent anti-boycott voices in the US, is also someone who regularly participates in other boycott activities. But what I'd like to stress at the moment is a more local case, the case of Danny Sellermeyer, Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at this university and therefore a colleague of mine. Danny Sellermeyer has been a vocal opponent of BDS at this university, the University of Sydney, playing a prominent role in 2014 to scotch a motion brought in the University of Sydney branch of the National Tertiary Education Union to begin discussions on whether to endorse the PACBI call. So Danny thought that BDS was so out of the realm of possibility that we couldn't even talk about it, and she argued strongly for that in the NTEU. In 2015, however, as an organiser of a human rights conference, she boycotted several Tamil non-government organisations by withdrawing their invitation to attend the conference that she was running, because the Sri Lankan military, who were also invited to the conference, made their own participation conditional on those NGOs' exclusion. So the moral that I'm drawing is that even BDS opponents have, rightly or wrongly, and that's a case-by-case judgment, but even BDS opponents have regularly acted to restrict academic freedom while also arguing for the primacy of that value when they condemn the institutional Israeli boycott. attempts to demonize BDS as a departure from normal academic practice fail, I think. What makes academic freedom academic? We can look for an answer to a common belief about higher education, that it serves social progress. We only think that research and teaching are good because there's some sense in which they make the world better. That shows that academic activity, research and teaching are means, not ends. They are means, not ends. And the boycott opponent has to give us a reason why academic activity in its maintenance in its current form should automatically trump other possible means to bring about social progress, like precisely the implementation of the boycott call. And at the very least, they have to give us, they have to demonstrate why academic dialogue is more likely to succeed in bringing peace in Israel-Palestine than BDS is. And at the very least, they have to give us reasons why they're prepared not even to try BDS for a limited period to see whether, in fact, it proves to be a more effective instrument of social progress than the more idealistic mechanisms that they prefer. And they certainly, and I'll wrap up on this point, have to give us a reason why they will do, in many cases, everything in their power to quash even any discussion of BDS so that the conversation about whether it is, in fact, a better and more powerful means than academic dialogue in the normal sense can even arise. So to BDS opponents' typical accusation in the form of the question, why just boycott Israel, we should make that reply. Why should we exempt officials of Israeli institutions from what are actually unexceptional acts of academic activity? Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thanks to the colleagues and friends who organized this conference. I'm very glad to be here with you. So I'm speaking on behalf of Handala-Italy, which is a group of Italian Middle East studies scholars, both historians and political scientists, who have been sharing both intellectual and political trajectories in the past few years. Handala-Italy conceive themselves as transnational scholars and activists. Actually, most of us are not based in Italy at the moment, and our political and intellectual trajectories cross national borders at several stages of our careers and formation. We are the first group of Italian Middle East studies scholars who publicly endorsed BDS and promoted it in several occasions. And we are all very pleased to share our experience with you today. The name of the group does not need an introduction in this context, of course, but perhaps you need to know why we choose to adopt a pen name to define our work and to define our group. The first reason is to mirror and to show our commitment to teamwork. And the second one is to protect the members from the legal and political intimidatory measures taken by the State of Israel against BDS supporters. And the case studies that I will present today will show you in which terms. A little bit of context. As perhaps you know, in Italy, the movement of support for Palestine has a long history, and it's quite a prominent movement. Generally speaking, the civil society in Italy has a long tradition, and it's also a movement which is across the political spectrum. Mainly in the context of the support of Palestine, the tradition is linked to the leftist movement, the Communist Party, of course. What was the Communist Party? And the leftist movements, but also the Catholic social movements have always been very active in support of Palestine. We also had high-profile political figures who supported the Palestinian movement and the fight of Palestinians. The most prominent, of course, was the then president of the Italian Republic, Sandro Pertini. And in 1982, in his speech for the end of the year to the nation, he condemned the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, just to give an example. But this was only one of the examples of very strong support by very high-profile political figures in the 70s and in the 80s. We also had very prominent Palestinian intellectuals and activists living in Palestine. I just named Wiles Whiter, who was assassinated in Rome. And he was a man of peace who built a parallel diplomacy to encourage Italian intellectuals and activists to support Palestine. So this is the broader context. Of course, the situation changed in the 90s, and both Italian politics and the commitment of the civil society shifted towards another directions. And the development of the BDS movement perhaps mirrors this trajectory. For the first time in Italy, a significant number, 344, of academics, researchers, and teachers in Italian universities responded to the invitation to join the PACBI and the BDS campaign in January 2016, so very recently. The signatories pointed out how to collaborate with Technion. So the campaign was against the collaboration with the Technion Institute in Israel. So the signatories pointed out how to collaborate with Technion means, in fact, supporting the Israeli occupation, colonialism, and apartheid regime, and being complicit in the oppression system that denies Palestinians the most fundamental human rights. Technion is in fact tied more than any other Israeli university to the Zionist military-industrial complex. It is actively involved in military research and the development of weapons used by the Israeli army against the Palestinian population, providing an indisputable support to military occupation and colonization of Palestine. The Institute has scientific cooperation with some Italian universities, including the Politecnico in Milano, the Politecnico in Torino, the University of Cagliari, Faculty of Medicine, the University of Florence against Medicine, the University of Perugia, Rome Tor Vergata, and Roma Tre. The Stop Technion campaign has thus set itself the objective of calling into question the idea of the legitimacy of academic cooperation with an institution, which, by virtue of its organic role in the architecture of Palestinian colonization, denies Palestinians the possibility of access to exchange of knowledge and, ultimately, the ideal of academic freedom at the core of the university mission itself. The launch of the campaign followed a series of initiatives organized by academics and students groups within several Italian universities. These initiatives were immediately subject to a series of repressive measures that have been configured as flagrant violation of the most fundamental freedom of thought and debate. Over the past 2 years, the attacks have intensified through the repeated denial of access to university spaces and the ban on organizing critical events of Israelis' policies towards Palestinians. While the Stop Technion campaign attracted the attention of international media, the DVC of the universities in Rome, Turin, Cagliari, and Catania distinguished themselves for their censorship. The rector of La Sapienza in Rome, Eugenio Gaudio, openly applauded the recent British criminalization laws of the boycott campaign, calling for a boycott of boycotts and, in a very worrying way, their possible criminal prosecution. The role of the Israeli embassy has not been and is not secondary in this crusade against the boycott campaign. Some articles published in newspapers and online headlines explicitly refers to meetings between embassy staff and academic authorities. In some cases, the role of the embassy and the Israeli government in censoring events related to PACBI and BDS campaigns has been the subject of investigations by the mainstream press. One of the most incisive censorship episodes took place at the University of Catania in March 2016 at the annual conference of the Italian Society for Middle East Studies. A roundtable discussion on academic boycott, regularly approved by the scientific committee, and I'm aware of that because I was part of the scientific committee, was subsequently removed at the explicit request of the rector of the university, who, according to well-documented script, would receive pressures by the Israeli embassy. The Catania episode raised the protest of a large group of scholars who refused to accept censorship and express solidarity with the panel, removed in a number of ways. They addressed letters of protest, they withdrew their panels, or they sent letters to the DVC and so on. The roundtable was then held outside of the program and was widely attended. So on one side, on the practical side, it was even better because it was held in a plenary session and all the participants to the conference attended the panel. But the most important thing is that the panel was not part of the official program anymore because the committee decided to remove it. While on one hand, the episode in Catania makes it clear that academic freedom and expressions work selectively and are suspended when they question official narratives, consolidated truths, or strategic interests, on the other side, exhibition as a rejection of cultural conformism and passive acceptance of the feudal organization typical of the academic world, it opens the possibility of producing critical knowledge and those acting in armored academic contexts. It is therefore within the spaces of rejections that the insurrections of knowledge can occur and allows the creation of resilient, rebellious political subjectivities to the disciplines of academic knowledge. From the rejection of the ethical compromise, which present the state of knowledge and the production of works, the choice made by a researcher from Torino University who refused a research work in collaboration with the Israeli University of Tel Aviv was also born. Keeping academic ties with Israel, writes the doctor, is equivalent to standardizing the state and its research institutes on the international scene, while the same country enforces violence and colonization policies, means giving recognition to the structures that underpin Israel's scientific productions and the relationship of these structures with the deportation of Palestinians by the state. Censorship and attempts to stifle the debate on these issues are a concerted effort by the Israeli representations in Italy, the Zionist pressure groups, and the highest Italian academic authorities to delegitimize those teachers and students groups who discuss the Israeli monopoly of the narration of Palestine and reveal the complicity and the agreements of scientific, technological, and industrial collaborations between Italy and Israel. It should be stressed how the effort to contain and discipline academics and who joined the Stop Technion campaign has involved not only the academic authorities. There is a counter-operation that has surprisingly disrupted all levels of national governance, from former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi to the then Minister of the University and Research, Giannini, and even to more or less unknown majors, such as the mayor of Turin, Piero Fassino. Indeed, it was a censorship of mastodontic dimensions, which is part of the wider framework of cross-mobilizations in many European countries. As highlighted by a recent article by Luigi Daniele, some European countries, including Italy, are discussing and developing on legalizing the criminalization measures for Israeli boycotting campaigns. These initiatives follow the European Union minimum liberal positions in favor of the protection of boycott rights, while rejecting the European itself any form of institutional boycott of Israel. The argument adopted to censor the boycott-friendly position is often centered on an alleged defense of academic freedom and dialogue, so it's a kind of example of Orwellian thinking or a rhetorical overthrow, considering the same authorities as denying these freedoms while claiming to defend them? Why is so much institutional violence mobilized against the boycott campaign? Ruba Saleh, a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, tried to answer these questions. In addition to reflecting the asymmetry of power between Palestinians and Israelis, as well as considerable economic interests, Saleh argues that this attitude stems from the inability of the Western so-called liberal universities to reduce cognitive dissonance between, on the one hand, self-representation focused on the neutrality of knowledge produced, and on the other hand, the profoundly political nature of academic complications with ethically destabilizing experiences of the 21st century Europe, such as colonialism, the resulting massacres of civilians and fascism. In the name of this alleged neutrality, it often tends to remove carrying out political operation and anything but neutral, like all the removal operations, the profound connections between European crimes of the 20th centuries and the policies of deportation and colonizations which Israel has put in place since its foundations. From this point of view, our academic authorities echo are very implicated in all this broader politics. The statements of former Prime Minister Premio Renzi visiting Israel during the Republican Day in 2015 goes also in this direction. Renzi declared that Israel is part of us, thus restoring these long-lasting relationships. To conclude, the university reflects a number of wider organic social and political processes, what we could call a neoliberal culture of government of dissent. The Israeli academics boycott campaign, given its numerous, multi-documented, and often claimed by the same Israeli universities and diplomatic representations abroad, complicity with the Palestinian population's multi-year oppression system is creating a crack in these organic relationships between universities and broader relationships, political and social formations. It is the index of a wider spread of an enormous potential academic counterculture in our country, a counterculture made of information events within universities, studies days, publications, translation of critical works by Israeli scholars, and also by Palestinians and internationals. So new spaces and new resistance initiatives are being created that are part of greater oppositions to the way in which our university, even through very rich collaborations and technological and ideological exchange with compromising and repressive institutions, such as the Israeli academic, seek to reproduce their economic and symbolic capital, also by supporting contemporary forms of colonialism, like that of Israel. In a university that is increasingly relying on precariousness and the possibility of having a vast pool of reusable intellectual proletarians, the creation of opposition faculties and the questioning of the structural gears and political orientation of this institution is scary. It is necessary to have the courage to raise this fear, to radicalize it, by combining all the forms of resistance to the neoliberal plant that for decades has characterized the production government of knowledge in our country. The fears of reactionary forces, such as those here briefly pointed out, can be ridden and transformed into further actions by radicalizing the forms of dissociation from the neoliberal and repressive policies of our academic institutions, and above all, by listening to the voice and the appeals of those, in this case, the civil society and the Palestinian Under Siege Academy, to pay the direct consequences of international alliances, such as those between Italian and Israeli institutions, on which these same policies are based. Thank you.